What's up, tribe? How you guys doing? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and I hope you like this video. Listen, this is the Secrets of Playboy season 1, episode 6. I think we're on. So first of all, let me thank you all who are watching my reviews. Last week I got a couple of comments under my last review that said that there are not a lot of YouTubers that are reviewing this. So thank y'all for finding me. Thank y'all for enjoying it. And you know, if you have any friends that's looking for somebody reviewing it, let them know we here, girl or guy. But this particular episode, Secrets of Playboy, it was called the Big Playboy Lie. And so this episode, it talked about the Playboy mantra was basically like, we're going to treat you like the girl next door. Like Playboy was all about that girl next door image. And so this whole episode was about the playmates, right? And so we deal a lot with Mickey Garcia again in this episode. If you remember last week, Mickey Garcia was the former playmate who ended up becoming the director of Playboy Promotions for many, many years. And remember, at the end of that episode, we saw that she had quit, and then she actually testified before Congress. So we're going to get into how that happened. So in the 1970s, Playboy, you know, prior to the 1970s, Playboy pretty much had the market. Like, it was almost a monopoly in the marketplace. Playboy generally just did topless photos. If they did do a full body, it was with a lot of innuendo, you know, strategically placed clothing, a strategic pose. But in the 1970s, with the sexual revolution that happened, and we start seeing more magazines pop up that were more risque. We have the Penthouses, we have the Hustlers, and then we have, you know, just any myriad of other imitations, right? And of course, they had to be different. They had to do something different. They had to be more salacious. And so they started doing full frontal with, you know, and Hugh Hefner actually started calling it the Pubic Wars. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. This episode gets a little raunchy, so I'm going to try to be as strategic as I can be with my language. But y'all are going to have to just roll with it, okay? This is definitely not for kids. So if you're listening to this in a car with your churn or something, this is not for kids. This episode, well, none of the episodes really are for kids. But so they're getting into what they call the Pubic Wars, right? So Hugh Hefner felt pressure to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. Like, he was no longer at the forefront of this industry. He's actually now playing catch up. And so he evolves. And in January of 1972, it was the first full frontal centerfold in Playboy. And that was Victoria, I believe her name was. By the mid 1970s, sales were down of Playboy magazine, and their resorts and clubs were also losing money. Again, remember, now you know, we see the rise of more of these types of, you know, again, everybody is imitating Playboy and they're doing it cheaper. So where are people going to go, right? So up until this point, Playboy was, so not up until this point, but the difference between Playboy and some of these other magazines is that Playboy was always seen as the respectable choice. Like, during this time period, they got even more applications for women who wanted to be playmates, because it was almost like, well, if you're gonna do it, you better go to Playboy, because Playboy, you got the respect. Playboy was seen as these, you know, the pillar of, y'all know what I'm saying, right? And so in the 1970s, that vision, that started sort of evolving a little bit, because they did start, their pictures did get a little raunchier. The pictures did get more explicit. And so the women actually ended up suffering, because the Playboy promise was, or the lie was, that you become a playmate and you're set. Like, doors open for you. You can go into acting. You can go into modeling. You can go into all these different avenues. And we know that for some women, that has happened. We have the Jenny McCarthy's. We have the Tracy, well, no, Tracy Lord. She was a porn star. I could name other people, but off the top of my head. But Jenny McCarthy is probably the first name that comes to my mind. After I get off of here, I'll think of 50 other women who were able to go through the Playboy system and come out and be successful, right? Especially like in the 80s. I shouldn't say especially in the 80s. I know of, because that's my area. I grew up. But we have the what's the other young lady? Anyway, I'll sit here all day trying to remember names. But again, Jenny McCarthy is probably the main person that pops in my mind. But there were other women, right? So we talk about these contracts. The Playmates signed these contracts, and remember we found out last week that they never got a copy of their contract. They would ask and ask and ask. Some would. Some wouldn't even ask. But some would ask and ask and ask, and they never actually got a copy of their contract. So they never really knew what it was that they were signing. But ultimately, they were just signing a blanket release, meaning anything that they did with Playboy was 100% Playboy's property, and there is no expiration date. It wasn't like, okay, well, this you can use my pictures for 10 years, and after 10 years, da-da-da-da-da. Or you can use my pictures for 5 years, and after that, no. Playboy can pull something out pictures that they took 50 years ago, and they could publish it, and there's nothing that any of the Playmates could do about it. Well, that doesn't sound ridiculous, right? Because in most cases, when you sign these releases, you don't have any control. I mean, unfortunately, that's what happened to Vanessa Williams when she was Miss America. She had done these pictures when she was younger, yada, yada, yada. Y'all know the story. And it was really nothing she could do because she had signed the release, and the man chose to use those pictures the way he used those pictures, and he sold them to, I think they were in Penthouse, right? So, was it Playboy? I don't think it was Playboy. I'd have to Google that, but I don't think it was Playboy. But I could be wrong. So, I don't think it was Playboy, though. Anyway, so, the thing we found out is when it wasn't a problem so much with the print. What ended up happening was they would take these videos as like the Playmate of the Year was doing her photo shoot. They would video the process, and they were told, hey, we're only going to take certain clips of this, for your Playmate, bio type thing. The most of this is going to end up on the cutting room floor, like you posing, meaning your whole body showing. That's not going to be shown. We're only going to show, us talking to you and moving you around, but we're not going to show all your business. And of course, that wasn't the case, because towards the late 70s, going into the 80s, is when we start this whole cable TV genre. And Hugh Hefner, he creates the Playboy channel, which eventually he turns into a pay-per-view situation. And he takes these videos and he turns them into like soft porn, right? And the Playmates, when they've signed these blanket releases, the money that they get, they end up siphoning that money off over a period of time, which basically keeps the Playmates hanging on. So when they first get the picture, they'll give them $5. I think the total price was like $25,000 you got, right? But they would spread that $25,000 out over a series of time. So when your picture gets published, you get $5,000. Then after a couple of months, you get another $2,500. Then once you do your video, you would get another $5,000. And then and so it sort of kept you on the hook, because that's why you did it to begin with. You did it for the money to begin with. And for a lot of women, other doors were closed to them, whether it was because Hugh Hefner would make phone calls and stop things from happening, or the industry just saying, we're not interested. Because once Playboy went from being that more respectable magazine, the girl next door type of thing, then they sort of lumped Playboy in with Hustler, Penthouse, and a lot of these other salacious magazines, and they became persona non grata. Nikki talked about how she tried to get a lot of those Playmates into different areas of modeling and things like that, and it didn't happen, because a lot of these big modeling agencies no longer wanted to have anything to do with the Playmates, because the name towards the late 70s going into the 80s, that respectability was starting to be gone, right? I don't know if that was a proper sentence. But anyway, so that's what that was. Probably one of the shocking isn't the word, because at this point I don't think it's anything that's gonna shock me in these about this stuff. But probably one of the most stunning statements on in this particular episode was they talked about how some of these playmates, and they actually had one of the women there, Stacy. She did her first photo shoot for Playboy when she was 17. Now, her parents signed off on it, which that's a whole nother conversation. But her parents signed off on it, and they held her pictures until she was legally 18. But she was a minor when she took those pictures. That just make you feel some kind of way about it, right? Like, if you're a man looking at Playboy, you're looking at a 17-year-old. Anyway. So, okay. So the videos were released without the women knowing, without their consent. I mean, again, they really didn't have to give consent because they had signed this release, but they didn't even know that the videos were like, they were lied to. And again, I know some of this goes back to being naive and all of that, but I'm just telling you what it is, y'all. And Mickey said while she was running Playboy Promotions, she told the girls, do not go to the mansion. She said there's nothing good happening at the mansion. But of course they went anyway, because again, that was how they would get their money. That was how they would get in Hugh Hefner's good graces, because of course the whole purpose of being Playmate of the Month was to become Playmate of the Year, which of course meant more money, more exposure, yada yada yada, right? It's that whole system. The Playmates were actually expected to be at the mansion, and once again we hear about drugs and partying and how a lot of these women got strung out on drugs, and we hear a couple of these stories. But one thing that came up in this episode that hadn't really come up in the other episodes was the eating disorders. These women were weighed, their weight was monitored. Now we talked about that with the bunnies, but the Playmates, the same thing, their weight was monitored. And a lot of it was at least 2 women in this episode that spoke of having eating disorders and how much weight they had lost. And one woman said she actually was hospitalized and had to get treatment to learn how to eat again, because she basically was using drugs to keep her weight down, and she wasn't eating food, and she was down to 90 pounds. 90 pounds. And Mickey said once they got strung out, he threw them away. Like, he had no use for them. And she told the story of one of the women who she really liked, and she really tried to get her to get into modeling, but she wasn't able to, make it happen. And she ended up getting strung out. And once she got strung out, Hugh didn't want to have nothing to do with her. He was kind of like, oh, well, she's no use to me anymore. And she said, I couldn't believe after all the money she wouldn't say the woman's name, but she said after all the money that he had made off of this woman, that he would just throw her away. Like, she was like, we can't even buy her no groceries. We can't help her pay her rent. Like, are you serious? The producer asked her, well, what did you do about it? She said, I did it anyway. Now, I thought something was interesting. They said that a couple of the Playmates here in this episode said that Hugh told them to stay away from Mickey. Said she's crazy and to stay away from her. And Mickey said during this time, he started kind of worrying about her because she was pushing back so much on him, and she was so angry about how things were going and how the women were being treated. And she said that she she said that, but she said, but what I was thinking, I was like, but why didn't he ever fire her? And the only thing I could think of is because he knew she knew where the bodies were buried, right? Because if you're telling the other girls stay away from her, you're the owner of the damn company. If she's that dangerous and she's that unhinged, fire her. But he didn't. She actually left. But that to me, that lended some credibility to what she's saying. Like, listen, I knew all the mess. I knew all the dirt. And he was afraid of what I would do, which ended up being a good fear. We'll get to that. Now, we meet a new name in this episode, a woman by the name of Valerie Krogan. Now, Valerie Krogan was actually a talent scout, for the Playboy modeling agency. But the women actually said she really was just Hugh's pimp. She would use her access as a talent agent to find women for help. Okay. Now, when Mickey left Playboy, she actually took over Playmate Promotions, and she pretty much turned it into an escort service. The women in this episode were talking about how they would be sent out on jobs, because remember last episode Mickey explained that the promotions were the women that went out and signed the autographs and did the car shows and did the. Well, they said that it got to the point where under Valerie, they would be being sent out to these modeling jobs or these gigs, and it wasn't really a real job, or it wasn't a real gig. It basically was a man who had paid for their company. A young lady by the name of Rebecca Armstrong told the story of being sent to Alaska for a job, and when she was sent to supposed to be like a rodeo type of thing down in Texas, and when she got down there, she said it was nothing. She said there was no event, there wasn't anything. She said she barricaded herself in the hotel, and she called Valerie, and Valerie was like, oh my gosh, well, let me find out what's going on. And then when Valerie called her back, she said, well, from my understanding, the client is very angry with you because you're not cooperating. She said there was another incident where they sent her to Alaska for a photo shoot. She got there was no real photo shoot. She said that she ended up just riding around Alaska with this guy who became obsessive. He found out where she lived. She said he ended up drugging her. And she said, I don't know what he did to me. She said she doesn't know exactly what he did, but then she said he did some pretty horrific things. So the only thing I could think of is that when she did come out of the haze, that her body told her some things had gone down, right? As women, men too, y'all know what I'm saying. But she doesn't know the specifics. Like, she can't say, well, first he did this, and then he did this, and then he did that. Now, going into the 80s, we started having, if you grew up in the 80s, you know what I'm talking about. Under Reagan, we had this whole moral majority situation going on, right? Where you had the extreme conservatism, you had the Bible Belt, you had, the evangelicals coming out, and they had this war on the pornography industry, even backed by Ronald Reagan and his attorney general, who started having these hearings. Massey, he started having these hearings, and the hearings were the commission against pornography. And that is where Mickey testified, which is where we left off in the last episode. And she testified to everything we're saying right now, right? The drugs, the sexual assaults, all of that. And that's what I said this to somebody. I think I might have said this in my last review. We're on episode 6. In every episode, there's a different woman telling her story about how she was sexually assaulted, right? Y'all know what I say around here. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Everybody ain't lying, okay? So, as a result of the commission, Massey actually got all of these magazines pulled out of the convenience stores, the 7-Elevens, the grocery stores, because prior to this, you could walk into a 7-Eleven and Playboy would be sitting right there, with the cover and everything, Hustler, Penthouse, all of that. So as a result, they pulled everything. They told the convenience stores, y'all can't just have that stuff sitting out where kids can come in to be getting a Slurpee, and it's just sitting right there in their faces. Well, Playboy actually ended up suing Massey, saying, like, that's crazy. Like, what are you doing? And they did end up getting the magazines put back on the shelves, but with covering. So Mickey said, listen, I know I hurt Hugh Hefner financially. Because when they had to pull those magazines, yes, he sued, and he was able to get his magazines put back on the shelf. However, in that year or however long it took, he got hurt. Because basically he was only surviving off of subscriptions. And, people would subscribe, but, it was a lot easier to walk into the grocery store and be like, oh, that's Playboy, let me get that, right? And even now, you may go into a store and see it, but all you see is the headline. You just see Playboy or Hustler. You have no idea what's underneath because it's covered up. So that's what came out as a result of these commissions. The other thing they talked about in this episode, they talked about in the 80s, we know we had the AIDS epidemic. And this is where Hugh Hefner got some accolades. Now, that same young lady, Rebecca Armstrong, she's the first playmate to be HIV positive. She said that she didn't tell him for a couple of years, but then eventually she did tell Hugh and tell them what was going on with her. And she said he absolutely had her back. And I will say this, from everything that they said here, that if you grew up in the 80s and you understand how AIDS, people who were HIV positive were pariahs. I mean, there was a little boy, they wouldn't let him go to school, Ryan. They wouldn't let him go to school. There were other people. It was just a lot, right? And she said that Hugh Hefner never did that. He actually was at the forefront of education. He understood that AIDS was not dirty and it wasn't, oh, you did something wrong. It was, it happened. We're going to deal with it. And she said that Hugh allowed her to basically become the spokesperson. She did PSAs for Playboy. She did videos, educating people about HIV and AIDS. She talked about how Hugh Hefner put articles and interviews and things in Playboy to educate people on HIV and AIDS and get away from the stereotypes and the stigma of it. So from that, listen, just because that was a great thing. I ain't gonna say it wasn't. But then the producer asked her, well, how do you know how you contracted it? She said, I don't. And she said, well, do you think it could have been from the guy, the guy from Alaska that sexually assaulted her? She said, it could have been. I have no idea. And she said, well, does that make you angry? And she said, the old me, yeah, but I've really worked on finding my peace and finding my zen. She said, are there some horrible people that work for Playboy? Yeah. There's some horrible people who were in Playboy promotions? Absolutely. And she talked about Valerie Krogan again. She said, but ultimately, I can't carry that anger at this point in my life. Now, the great thing is that she's still alive, right? For not a lot of people came out of the 80s because there wasn't a lot, but a lot of people didn't come out of the 80s, well, after their diagnosis. So that's, bravo to her and brava to her. So then they said, well, with all of these things that he did the activity change at the Playboy Mansion? She's like, absolutely not. So even though publicly he was this great champion and educator and all of that, he was still doing what he was doing behind closed doors, which was very risky behavior at the mansion. Ultimately, what came out of this is that, again, like I said, Playboy owns everything. Playboy owns all of their pictures, videos, likeness, stillness, whatever. And ultimately, a lot of these women's pictures that they did back in the 80s, 90s, 70s, whatever, a lot of those pictures and videos have found their way into hardcore porn sites. So whereas they posed for Playboy, somewhere down the line, those pictures that they took for Playboy, those sessions, those videos that they did for Playboy have found their way into other areas and into some very hardcore porn sites. So that was tonight's episode. Y'all let me know what y'all think. Drop it in those comments. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.